in this whole drama, there was one decisive moment for me that was kind of the focal point of the whole moral issue. And for me, ultimately, the moral issue didn't have to do with Aboriginal people, didn't have to do with the church or anything. It had to do with the response I had to make to an offer put to me. It happened on January 23rd, 1995. It was the day I was removed from my pulpit. And I was called down to my church office by two church officials. Both my wife Ann and I were called down, and I was handed my letter of dismissal. And in that letter, it asked me to take part in a lie. It asked me to condemn myself by taking part in a lie. It said that if I was to stay a minister in the United Church, I had to agree to, among other things, a psychiatric evaluation. And by saying yes to that, I felt not only would be a lie, but I'd be incriminating and condemning everything I'd been doing in that church for almost 3 years. It would be saying that none of it was valid because it was the actions of a crazy man. It would be to condemn any person who came into that church who was different, who had responded to my offer of an open door. It would be to say all of that was wrong. Feeding the poor, opening my pulpit to Native people, trying to live the Gospels of Jesus, all of that was crazy. It would be like spitting on everything that I had held up and done. That came from here, that came from my sense of what was right and just to do in the world. I'd be condemning myself and saying that no, none of it was sane. And so I knew I couldn't say yes to that, and yet my wife Ann said she thought I should, to keep my job, to keep on good terms with the church, go along with the lie. I knew at that moment that was the moral issue. What kind of man would ask me to take part in that lie, just to cover themselves, make me the scapegoat so that they and other people didn't have to answer for the things that they had done in that community? It was incredible what was being asked of me. And I knew I'd say no. I wouldn't go along with the lie. I didn't know at the time what it would cost me. What I thought was everything. But I couldn't have done anything else. That to me was the turning point in many ways. It, for me, summed up what was at stake. Do we go along with lies? Do we sacrifice what we know is true for the sake of a job or to get along with people? It was one of the things that caused me to see the real truth about what the church was. That incident where they asked me to take part in a lie, the mask over the church slipped for me, and I saw more of who those people really were and what was really motivating them. And what was really interesting is they kept trying to get me to go along with that lie. They didn't try just once. They asked me in that first letter, they handed me the letter of dismissal. They said, we expect you to agree to take a psychiatric evaluation. They didn't give any proof or evidence why they thought I needed that test. They just expected me to say yes. And 2 days after I was given that letter of dismissal, I got another registered letter from one of the men who was there, Cameron Reed, the Presbytery official. The other fellow was Art Anderson, the personnel minister for the United Church in BC. But Cameron Reed wrote me a letter 2 days later, registered, and it threatened to delist me, that is, completely throw me out of the church, defrock me, take away my ordination, unless I agreed to that demand on me about the psychiatric evaluation. They said in the letter that they expected me to respond no later than February 9th, 1995, to that demand. Well, what was interesting was that was the exact same date that the RCMP had announced they were going to open their public investigation into the Alberni Indian Residential School in Port Alberni. So they obviously wanted me dealt with before that investigation opened. That told me a lot, the fact that it was the same date. But it didn't end there. When I didn't agree to that, we went into negotiations, and for the next 6 months, they didn't let up. They had 3 different committees set up within the Comox Nanaimo Presbytery to deal with me, to try to get me to agree to those demands. You know, and I went along to some degree. I said, okay, I'm willing to do some pastoral retraining. I can pick up those skills. I expect to be paid for that, of course. They wanted me to do it for nothing, even though I had 2 children to support. I was somehow supposed to do that. But I adamantly refused to take the psychiatric exam because I wouldn't be the scapegoat. I wouldn't be portrayed as somebody who was unstable when I knew I wasn't. I mean, you have to have the patience of a saint and the stability of a rock to survive in that kind of place with those kinds of pressures. I knew the problem that they were trying to create wasn't there, but by not going along, I created this crisis within their whole system, and I couldn't understand that at first. Why me not agreeing to a psychiatric evaluation was somehow throwing their whole presbytery officialdom into such a crisis. But they tried for the next 6 months, 3 different committees, and I didn't agree. And because of that, they eventually canceled all the negotiations, kept me on ice, didn't allow me to work anywhere. They wouldn't release me from that presbytery to get a job anywhere else. So I was kept on ice. And it wasn't until early the next year that they went ahead and recommended me for delisting. And what happened was, the very same week that the first group of Aboriginal survivors of the Alberni Residential School started to sue the United Church, that's in the first week of February 1996, the same week, actually it was within 3 days of that lawsuit being announced, the Comox Nanaimo Presbytery recommends that I be permanently delisted or defrocked from the United Church. So it was very obvious then that they were panicking and wanted me out of the church altogether before these lawsuits began. So again, the mask kept slipping for me, but it was clear that they were trying to peg me as some kind of crazy so that they can then justify themselves, scapegoat me and say, you see, there was nothing wrong in the church, it was just this crazy minister. I didn't go along with that, and my simple no threw their whole plan askew. The other really humorous part of this, or another humorous part of this, because it's a continual comedy, I think, and I think it's good I can laugh about it now, actually, because it's so absurd. The agenda was so obvious. But now, looking back, one of the things that was significant was that during my delisting trial, where they spent $250,000 throwing me out in the only public delisting of a United Church minister in its history, as part of the questions we were asking, they produced the questions that their appointed psychiatrist was going to ask me if I had have agreed to the psychiatric evaluation. You see, according to the rules of the psychiatric community in BC, the church couldn't do that. The psychiatrist had to be appointed through mutual consultation, so I would have actually, under law, should have had the right to help appoint the psychiatrist. But no, the church said it had to be the psychiatrist of their choosing. Okay? And they were going to ask me a series of questions, this he or she. And guess what the first question they were going to ask me was? Why did I write the letter challenging the United Church about its sale of Lot 363 on the Ahousaht community to a businessman associated with McMillan Bloedel, their corporate benefactor? The psychiatrist was going to ask me why I wrote that letter. Now, why would writing a letter inquiring about a bogus and illegal land transaction involving the church, why would that be a matter of psychiatric controversy or a thing that a psychiatrist would be concerned about? I mean, clearly it was a political agenda all along, because I blew the whistle on the land deal, and they wanted to try to find a way of, well, really incriminating me, because if I had have agreed to a psychiatric test, I'm assuming it would have been some acknowledgement on my part that their suspicion about my stability was justified, when of course I knew it wasn't at all. So it's interesting how these things gradually manifest if you persist in what you know is true long enough. I've never lived through such Kafkaesque insanity as when I went through something that cost the United Church over $250,000. For all you people out there who might think of ever contributing to the United Church financially, don't. This is how they use your money. They pay lawyers. They actually paid one lawyer over $50,000 to have me thrown out of the church. He made well over $50,000 in that one effort. Ian Benson, a right-wing Catholic lawyer they hired to drive me out of the United Church. The way he did that was through methods that normally would have got him disbarred anywhere else in the world. Fabricating evidence, soliciting evidence outside the courtroom in the middle of a trial, consulting with the judge during the trial, consulting with panel members during the trial. I mean, all these things completely illegal normally, but allowed in this United Church closed hearing. But the thing that was really insane about the whole thing was that it was also arranged. The man who originally helped have me fired, Brian Thorpe, appoints the three people who are going to decide whether I'm going to remain a minister or not. The man who was the lawyer for the presbytery that had me removed is the judge at the hearing. And these Thorpe and Jessamine, who helped set up the trial, Jessamine, who's the judge, the three people who are on the panel, they're all from the same in-group. So it's imagining similar to if you were going into a court of law and the judge and the jury and the prosecution are all from the same club. Let's say they're all Freemasons or all members of the same church. Gee, I wonder what kind of verdict you're going to get out of that. Especially when the judge and the jury go off to lunch together and have discussions outside the courtroom, which was going on in the midst of my delisting trial. They hoped that the trial would last maybe 3 days and then get a quick delisting. It dragged on over 6 months because I kept asking really hard questions to them all the time. I kept saying, for example, I'd like to know the charges against me. They said, there are no charges against you. I said, I'd like to see the evidence against me. They say, we can't show you the evidence. I'd say, I'd like to face my accusers. Well, you can't do that. They just denied all the time. Denied me that natural justice. Yet on the basis of that totally hearsay evidence, they were going to judge my suitability for remaining a minister in the United Church, even though they said at the beginning of the trial that hearsay evidence would not be allowed. So they're openly contradicting themselves by the way they operated. The judge kept Jessamine, who again was the lawyer for the church, turns around, he puts on another hat and he's the judge at the hearing. He keeps leading the panel all the time. Maybe you should be asking this question to Kevin. Intervening, I asked, time and again, I kept interrupting and asking what the charges were against me, what the basis was of the whole trial. And I kept a record. Over 80% of my motions were turned down. Yet all of the motions of the other side were approved by the judge, so it's completely biased. The other thing that was really crazy was they said right at the very beginning of the hearing that, to show you how crazy it was, we asked, let me put this in context, sorry. We asked right at the very beginning to know what the basis was in the United Church for delisting a minister. That is, what are the grounds for defrocking a minister? We have to know that basic question before we can prepare a defense. So Molly, what was her name? Oh, Molly something or other. I'll remember it. She was the chair of the panel. Molly Williams. She was a United Church minister. She was chairing the panel. She said in response to that, and it was mind-boggling her response, she said, there is no, in the United Church manual, there are no grounds for defrocking a minister. We will establish those grounds at the end of the hearing. You don't need to know those grounds. And I said, excuse me, under law, and even I know that, even I took a year of law at the University of BC, and even a layman knows that you have to know the charges against you before you can prepare a defense. You have to know what is the grounds for taking away my professional livelihood so I can mount a defense on my own behalf. But they said, we're not going to tell you what the grounds are. We're not going to give you any evidence. We're not going to show you the charges. We're not going to let you face your accusers. We're not going to even let you know the terms by which this hearing is operating. Yet, you have to take part in it. I mean, that is the most crazy thing I've ever witnessed in my life. And yet, if I didn't take part in it, they're saying you're being disruptive, all the other things they said about me subsequently on the internet, that I didn't want to cooperate. Well, you're damn right. Eventually I didn't cooperate with it because I had to walk out of that hearing when it was becoming totally absurd, and we found out that, this is the straw that broke the camel's back, we found out that from evidence they themselves submitted, that it was the judge of the delisting hearing, John Jesselman, who had recommended that all negotiations with me cease months before that. So the very judge who was chairing that panel to decide whether I was to stay in the United Church had disrupted and stopped negotiations between me and the presbytery. If that isn't a blatant, gross conflict of interest, and blew away any notion that he could be neutral in this whole process, when he was the paid lawyer for the very people working to throw me out of the church. At that point, when I put forward a motion that he remove himself on the grounds that he could not act as a fair and impartial judge, and that Miss Molly Williams, of course, at that point turned down my motion and said, no, he isn't in a conflict of interest. At that point, we just left, because to take part further, under legal advice, I was told that if you take part in this kangaroo court that isn't following natural justice or the rules of procedure of any normal court, if you take part in that, you're jeopardizing further or future legal action, possibly against the United Church, because you're going along with something that's a miscarriage of justice. That's when we left. But it was interesting. We took part in it long enough to allow these absurdities to be shown. I mean, there was 20 or 30 people in the visitors gallery watching this thing, and they were literally, people watching this were breaking up. They were laughing or in tears. They were so appalled by this. One guy, he came up to me, he was a former Victoria policeman, retired. He said, why are you taking part in this kangaroo court? Beth Johnson, the mayor of Delta at the time, was an observer. She wrote me a long 5-page letter later saying that she had never seen anything so appalling, that it betrayed every notion of natural justice and due process that she had ever taken part in. One thing we learned, in a self-regulating body like the church, they can create their own rules, they can set up their own kangaroo court, and even the Attorney General later, Ujjal Dosanjh, said, we're not going to intervene in what happened because it was an internal church matter. Well, 28 people wrote to him saying this was a complete miscarriage of justice. This guy was set up and the verdict was established long before the trial ever began, and yet he refused to take part in any investigation of the kangaroo court because it was a church matter, and the church could do whatever they want. We've learned that, of course, from the history of the residential schools. They can kill kids and get away with it. Why wouldn't they be able to destroy a man's reputation and livelihood and get away with it? Which they did. You know, when people learn these facts of what went on at the infamous delisting trial, they just laugh, of course, and it's one of the reasons that the church has created a whole fog around what really happened in order to cover up the crime, really. I mean, it's almost like the crime of the cover-up is just as serious as the original crime. And, for example, on the internet now, the United Church, soon after the hearing was over, and they decided, of course, unanimously to defrock me and delist me, even though they'd never proved their case. They'd never actually shown that I was unsuitable for ministry. They nevertheless defrocked me anyway. And they then put out over the internet this incredible pack of lies of how, you know, they had proved somehow that Kevin was not acknowledging the authority of the church and blah, 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 these other things. What was interesting is, at the time, they never said what the charges against me were. Yet later, suddenly they created all these charges. When the press began snooping around, they had one story for the press, but during the delisting trial, there was never anything I was accused of. They had accused me of nothing, and yet I was being defrocked. And to give an example of how they censored the whole transcript of the hearing, we presented 38 letters of reference, character references about me, about my suitability for ministry from members of all my congregations I'd ever been in, and from other people, character references. And we submitted those to the panel. Not one of them appeared in the final report. Not one of them is quoted by the United Church today, even though they were entered as bona fide evidence. The letters they present as evidence are 4 letters They are not bona fide evidence because they were solicited in the course of the trial by Ian Benson, the lawyer for the Presbytery. Now, under the rules of natural justice, you cannot solicit evidence in the course of a trial. Right? You have to look at the evidence beforehand and then on the basis of that work out your case. But this guy went out and solicited 4 letters from church officials who are already hostile to me and present that as the only entered evidence. When we had submitted all those letters, suddenly they vanished. They're not there anymore. That's an example of the duplicity and the deceit that goes on. And that's at the highest level of the church. This is an official website of the United Church where they're putting that kind of criminal material up over the internet and passing it off as the truth of what Kevin Annett. You know, the other example of how the state helps the church with that is when the hysterical incident of when, in the course of a press conference, the 2 guys who were responsible for that whole delisting facade were Thorpe and Jessamine. There's a priceless scene where I'm having this press conference, and I've got evidence showing that the United Church was the legal guardian of children in the residential schools, and hence were legally liable for all of the crimes that went on there. And it was explosive evidence at the time. This would have been in the fall of 1997, right when the court was hearing the evidence. It was the first trial of Indian men and women suing the United Church for their school in Port Alberni. And the church and the government were each pointing fingers at each other saying, no, they're responsible, no, they're responsible. Well, I found evidence that the church were the legal guardians of the kids, and so it was a slam dunk proof that the church was liable and hence should be found guilty for these crimes. Well, at the press conference when I presented these evidence, Jessamine and Thorpe appear at the door, and we have this on film. Thorpe goes over and rifles through my stuff and takes out the evidence. Well, Jessamine is watching him and encouraging him and even holding the door for him. They hurry off into the church office after that. I go in there asking for the evidence back because somebody told me that they had taken it. And Thorpe, the little weasel, you know, he's trying to hide the stuff he had just stolen out of my belongings, and he's pretending he doesn't have it. I mean, it's incredible, the childishness of these people, right? And Jessamine finally says, it doesn't matter, Brian, give it back to him, right? And so after that, we've got the proof. We go to the police and try to get him charged with theft. The police take 5 months to respond, and finally the Crown Counsel, a guy called Garth Gibson, says, it's true that a theft occurred, but it's in the public interest not to pursue this, right? So, in other words, once again, the government covering for acts of criminal nature by church officials.